What if everything you thought you knew about old rivals like China and Vietnam was wrong? Before we start, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. And tell me in the comments, how would you manage life next to a superpower like China? Now let's begin. Imagine standing in a quiet village near the China-Vietnam border. Mist drifts down from Yunnan's mountains. On the Vietnamese side, rice paddies stretch to the horizon. And beside you, a resident who has lived his entire life in the shadow of a giant. When I asked him how people here feel about China, he paused. It's complicated, he admitted. And it is. For over 1,000 years, the relationship between these two nations has swung between resistance and cooperation, war and trade, fear and admiration. Vietnam, a nation of 100 million, sits directly beneath China, home to 1.4 billion. The imbalance is enormous. The history is heavy, and the future still uncertain. Yet despite centuries of tension, that same resident has relatives working in China's Yunnan province because the salaries there are far higher. Chinese electronics sit on his desk. Investors from China are opening shops in nearby towns. And the younger generation in Vietnam? They admire China's speed, technology, and lifestyle. With a neighbor that big, he told me, conflicts need dialogue, not pride. Only a decade ago, Vietnamese stores barely carried Chinese goods. Today, supermarkets across Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are lined with products from Guangdong, Guangxi, and Zhejiang, while Shanghai markets sell mangoes from southern Vietnam. A strange sight, considering the violent clashes the two socialist states fought between 1979 and 1990 along the border. But now China is Vietnam's largest trading partner, and their annual trade volume has surged to around $170 billion. So how did two nations with such a turbulent past manage to restore trust? The long shadow of empire for centuries, Imperial China viewed Vietnam as a tributary state. Vietnamese dynasties repeatedly rebelled, forging a national identity rooted in resistance. Later came French colonial rule. After independence, both North and South Vietnam abandoned Chinese characters and adopted the Latin alphabet, partly to distance themselves from China's cultural influence. But geopolitics twists history. During Vietnam's war against France, from 1946 to 1954, China supplied weapons, funding, and training to Vietnamese forces. In the following decades, Chinese military advisors and volunteers participated in conflicts against both French and American forces across Vietnam. Only recently did the Vietnamese government publicly acknowledge that around 300,000 Chinese volunteers took part. And only recently did they formally thank them. But as the Cold War evolved, the alliance fractured. Vietnam oriented itself firmly toward the Soviet Union. China normalized relations with the United States. Two socialist neighbors suddenly found themselves on opposite sides. In 1979, China invaded northern Vietnam to retaliate for Vietnam's overthrow of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, China's ally. The fighting lasted 1 month, but altered the region for years. Vietnam responded by pushing ethnic Chinese communities to choose citizenship or leave, banning Chinese language education, closing temples, and deploying 600,000 soldiers along the border. Dozens of kilometers of territory were mined. Chinese goods vanished overnight. 1991. The Quiet Reset. Everything changed when China and Vietnam signed an agreement known as the Four Guiding Principles. Good neighbors, good friends, good comrades, good partners. The border was cleared of mines. Propaganda urging citizens to boycott Chinese goods faded. And as both economies liberalized in the 1990s, Vietnam quietly adopted many aspects of China's reform model, though it officially credited Soviet-era inspiration. Back then, trade between China and Vietnam stood at only $32 million, with no flights and no tourism. Today, millions of Chinese tourists visit Vietnam each year. Trade has multiplied more than 5,000 times. Money, it turns out, heals wounds faster than ideology. But stability has a price. This reconciliation is not without tension. In 2018, northern Vietnam saw mass protests over proposed special economic zones that could allow Chinese investors to lease land for 99 years. Disputes in the South China Sea, especially around the Spratly Islands, remain unresolved, with the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Brunei also involved. In 2014, when China installed an oil platform in waters claimed by Vietnam, Violent anti-Chinese riots erupted. Factories burned. For Chinese citizens died. Vietnam soon apologized, and China accepted, both governments aware that open conflict was no longer an option. There were other incidents, too. Vietnamese fishing boats sunk by Chinese naval vessels in contested waters. But Vietnam responded with diplomacy rather than force. A retired educator in Hanoi summed it up simply. Losing Chinese investment, Chinese tourists, and Chinese markets would be catastrophic. No one wants that. A new generation, a new lens 15 years ago, surveys showed widespread fear of China in Vietnam. China's power, size, and wealth were intimidating. Today, many young Vietnamese admire China's rapid development. TikTok, a Chinese platform, is the second most popular social network in Vietnam. During the celebrations for the 80th anniversary of Vietnam's independence from France, Chinese soldiers marched in a parade in Hanoi. Crowds cheered. Flowers were thrown, a scene that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. Now, for millions of young Vietnamese, it means innovation, opportunity, and modernity. Two nations once trapped in cycles of conflict now find themselves bound by trade, tourism, investment, and mutual pragmatism. History hasn't disappeared, but economics has reshaped the landscape. And whether the future brings competition or cooperation, one truth stands clear. When a rising power and a rising neighbor share a border, peace becomes a strategic necessity, not a romantic ideal.